So I just wanted to give a little bit of background to the Ban the Box campaign for those of you who aren't already familiar with us. Ban the Box was launched in October last year. We had a high-profile media launch with coverage on many different media channels, including BBC Breakfast, and also on the One Show where Joan Collins endorsed the campaign as well, an unexpected advocate, but one that we were very pleased to hear, because what we are asking employers to do through the Ban the Box campaign is to give people with criminal convictions a fair chance at accessing employment and to be assessed on their skills and abilities before their convictions are taken into account. And in order to do that, the campaign asks UK employers to do two things. We ask you as employers to remove the default tick box from job application forms that asks about unspent criminal convictions. And we ask you to commit to making an informed decision about when and how you do seek disclosure of convictions, if at all. And we're going to focus a bit on that today to help you understand a bit more about when may be appropriate and what are some of the ways in which you might consider asking. We would like all of you to ban the box, and this webinar should help you understand, once you've taken that tick box off the first stage of the process, when is the right time to ask and how. So a little bit of context in terms of what's wrong with the box. Why is the box a problem? Many of you will probably be familiar with some of the stats that are out there. There's 9.2 million people in the UK with a criminal conviction. A fifth of job seekers allowance claimants have unspent criminal convictions. And you'll probably be aware that there are very high levels of reoffending in the UK, which leads to huge costs in terms of cost to individuals, but also cost to the state. And we know that reoffending itself costs around £11 billion a year. And employment, there's a strong body of evidence that demonstrates that employment is one of the most effective ways of reducing that level of reoffending. What's wrong with the tick box specifically? Well, the tick box, we know, acts as many employers are using it as a way to screen out people at the first stage of a recruitment process, and 3/4 of employers have admitted to using it to either reject someone outright or select between candidates. And that's not the only problem. The problem as well is the fact that the box itself is a very blunt tool that gives no real opportunity for an individual to contextualize or in any way explain the circumstances around their offence. But also, on the other side of things, it doesn't give the employer a fair opportunity or a realistic opportunity to actually assess risk or relevance of those convictions to the role. And we know that 1 in 7 employers would reject a candidate outright just on that tick box, irrespective of the nature of their offence. It also puts people off applying for jobs. So people are deselecting out people who may well be the right people for your workforces. They're self-selecting out of the process when they see that tick box because they don't know how that information is going to be treated. And in many cases, their experience is that once they tick that box, they don't hear back again from an employer. Finally, we're also concerned that employers are missing out on some really good people for their jobs as a result of some of the things I've just mentioned. So a number of the employers that we work with report that they found some of their best and most loyal employees by suspending judgment and really allowing people to prove their skills and abilities first. The reality is that many people who have already paid for their mistakes continue to be punished by being denied the opportunity to move on from their past, to contribute to society, and in many cases to provide for their families. So if you don't ask at the first stage, if you take that box off application forms, when do you ask and how? This is the main focus of what we're going to talk through today, and I think the important thing to emphasize right from the start is that there is no single right answer. We're not advocating a specific alternative approach. There are many different approaches, and it very much depends on what the employer is confident with, what they're comfortable with, what fits with their recruitment systems. But the important thing is it's not the first thing you find out about someone, so it is taken off that first stage. There's a number of different times in an application process when employers can ask. Some of the businesses we've spoken to have talked around asking after shortlisting, so they can potentially tell employers or potential employees that they will be asked to disclose their convictions potentially at interview or after a conditional job offer. Some employers have chosen to not ask at any point in the recruitment process about convictions. They feel that they have, through their existing recruitment mechanisms, they have the right systems to assess suitability in other ways, and that convictions aren't relevant for their roles. And we'll come on to talking a little bit about some of that a bit later on. In terms of how to ask, there's really two main ways that people can be asked to disclose their convictions. It's really either verbally or it's in writing. And again, there is some thinking out there that says that written disclosure can be the best way of doing it because it gives the applicant more control over their story. It potentially gives the employer more time to consider what's been disclosed. But there's also a strong case for those disclosures being verbal as well, and I know that both Sarah and Lee will probably touch on that in their bits as well. I think the verbal disclosure gives an opportunity for more discussion and an opportunity for the employer to explore in a bit more detail the relevance to the role. In terms of criminal records checks, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this because this is something that we covered in quite a lot of detail at our previous webinar, and we will, as a follow-up from this webinar, we will share with you the slides or a link to where the slides are from our previous webinar so you can find out a little bit more about what we covered then. But in terms of criminal records checks, broadly speaking, there are three main types. And I'm just going to very briefly touch on the types of checks that you as employers can do. On this first row you'll see here, you'll see that we have jobs such as catering, hospitality, construction, cleaning, retail, basically most jobs, the majority of roles out there. These roles are defined as unregulated roles. You may have come across that terminology before. And by unregulated, what we mean is they are covered by the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974, which in effect restricts an employer's right to know about certain convictions after a specific time period. Now, that act was actually updated last week. There's lots and lots of information which we'll signpost you to later on in the webinar to find out more information about what roles are covered by that act. But in essence, what it means is that there is no legal, there's no check legally required for employers to do about an individual's criminal background. And any checks that they do choose to do would be restricted to a basic disclosure check, and that would only show unspent convictions. And again, we'll touch more on some of the terminology later. The second two rows on this slide that you'll see in front of you are roles that are defined as regulated roles. By regulated, what we mean is that they are exempt. They're jobs that are exempt from the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. And what that means, in essence, is that employers have the right to find out a little bit more information about an individual's criminal convictions, both spent and unspent, unless filtered. And you'll see at the bottom of this slide that there is a website address here for the Disclosure and Barring Service. The DBS is the organisation that conducts those checks, and it's important to assume that if you're not absolutely confident about what type of role you're recruiting for, do check that website because there's lots of information on there that can tell you whether you are recruiting for an unregulated role or a regulated role. And the reason why that's important is because it will shape the way in which you ask about criminal convictions. And I think it's also important to emphasise at this stage that through the Ban the Box campaign, we are focusing largely on unregulated roles. So we're not explicitly calling for a change in the way in which regulated roles are managed. Although that's not to say that it's not achievable, and it'll be interesting, I think, when you hear from Lee from NACRO a bit later on to understand how NACRO have adopted Ban the Box for all of their roles that include a mix of regulated and unregulated.